You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. The Rewilding Earth podcast is supported by businesses such as Patagonia, Catula, and Biohabitats, as well as the Whedon Foundation and listeners like you. If you love the work that the Rewilding Institute is doing, please consider donating at rewilding.org. And be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter while you're there. George Wuerthner is a professional photographer, writer, and ecologist. He's written more than 24 books on natural history and other environmental topics. He's currently the Ecological Projects Director for the Foundation for Deep Ecology and the Executive Director of Public Lands Media. Wuerthner has visited hundreds of mountain ranges around the West, more than 380 wilderness areas, more than 180 national park units, and every national forest west of the Mississippi. Thus, there are very few people as qualified to be a co-author of a new paper released in Bioscience with two other Rewilding Leadership Council members, Reed Noss and Eileen Christ. Entitled Rewilding the American West, the paper is an authoritative answer to the Biden administration's call to conserve, connect, and restore the lands, waters, and wildlife upon which we all depend.
The idea behind it was to take advantage of the Biden administration's proclamation or announcement that they want to protect 30% of the United States land area by 2030. And, that's a very ambitious project. And of course, depending upon how you define what's protected, it may or may not rise to what some people's expectations are. So we wanted to have something out there that could set sort of, you might say, a bar or a goal that would be scientifically defensible and at the same time actually get us partway to that 30-30 goal. The idea was to look at two species, wolves and beaver, that are in their own way, individual ways, what we would call keystone species. In other words, they influence the ecosystem more than their individual influence, you might say. They set the stage for a whole lot of other species to react to them and be affected by their presence. So the first thing was to sort of delineate lands that were suitable for wolves, large enough to sustain viable wolf populations, but with corridors between the larger land areas so that there could be some genetic exchange between each of these reserves. And when that was done for the West, we came up with 11 areas proposed as reserves for wolves to try to establish viable populations back on the landscape of wolves. The next thing to add in was to promote the restoration of beaver. And beaver are, you might say, water engineers. They have all sorts of influences on rivers in multiple ways. For example, by creating their beaver dams, they slow the water, which reduces, of course, erosion during floods. It also, across the West, has been responsible for creating lots of wet meadows in the past. And of course, a lot of that wet meadow creation has been lost because beaver have been eliminated from so many watersheds or greatly reduced. And another thing that they do, of course, is with the water impounded, it slowly seeps into the ground and helps to maintain water flow during the later part of summer seasons when you have less rainfall. So it makes a steadier flow in streams, which would have benefits, for example, for endangered salmon and trout around the West and other endangered fish. 4/5 of the native fish in the West are listed or candidates for listing under the Endangered Species Act. So this is not an insignificant thing to try to reestablish better water flows and better water quality by allowing beavers to do their thing. And so then the next step we did was to look at endangered species and try to see what was the main proximate causes of species endangerment. In other words, were they endangered because of hunting? Were they endangered because of logging? Were they endangered because of livestock raising or whatever? And it turns out, not too surprisingly, in the West, more species are affected by livestock raising than any other factor. The next thing was to decide where those endangered species were. And of the 11 reserves, the Mogollon Plateau and southern Colorado, northern New Mexico, southern Rockies had the most overlap with endangered species. That is, the reserves that we have chosen based on wolves and restoration of ecosystems. Those are the ones that had the most endangered species, which is not surprising given that you have more species further south than you would in the north, where glaciation eliminated a lot of habitat in the past, and most of the species come back are more similar further north than in the south, where they've had more time to sort of biologically diverge, and also because a lot of these species are connected to water. The Southwest and its aridness tends to mean that you're going to have more water-dependent species that are at risk. So that was the sort of the general plan. And after we mapped all this, and realizing, of course, that livestock raising is the major impact, we are advocating that livestock raising be terminated on these areas. It would be about 29% of the western United States public lands. And we would do that through a permit buyout proposal where ranchers would be paid a compensation based on the animal unit months or the amount of forage that they are permitted to graze on public lands. And I hasten to add that grazing on public lands is a privilege and not a right. And so we're under no obligation to pay for anything. However, realizing that many of these ranchers have come to depend upon the public lands and that they are partly have a lot of political power, the best thing is to try to provide some sort of off-ramp that would allow them to either buy another more private land or just retire or whatever.
I really like how this paper starts out, and it's very, very smart. It's throwing the administration's call or challenge of conserving, connecting, and restoring lands, waters, and wildlife upon which we all depend. And I mean, they're talking about rewilding whether they know it or not. When the administration is saying that, boy, what a challenge, and boy, how you all have answered it.
Yeah, well, and partly as I mentioned at the very beginning, was because they're sort of ambiguous about how they define, conserved or protected lands. And some people would say, well, we're going to have logging as protected lands, grazing as protected lands. And, that really doesn't pass muster with a lot of, the more conservation-minded biologists and ecologists. Mm-hmm. And so we wanted to at least get something out there that would protect lands from resource extraction for the most part. And, and I hasten to add, what I'm saying here is mostly my views. I can't speak for all the authors who contributed to this. But, in my view, I would see these reserves being areas where most natural resource extraction would cease. Whether that's livestock raising, whether that's logging, whether that's oil and gas development, et cetera. And so that would certainly, if that were the case, really help to get the Biden administration to its goals that in a way that really is an effective way to protect biodiversity and help deal with climate warming and change.
You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. From humble beginnings to global conservation phenomenon, the rewilding movement continues to grow and thrive amid the greatest ecological challenges our planet has faced in 65 million years. Here's how you can join us and help return balance to nature. First, go to rewilding.org and subscribe to the weekly digest to keep up on the latest rewilding news, interviews, and art. Second, consider donating to support the Rewilding Institute's mission to rewild North America and beyond. And for extra credit, please like, subscribe, and share this podcast to help spread the word. Thanks so much for your support.
On an individual pond level, it is very impactful, but what are we talking about for the entire area if beavers are brought back in a significant way?
Well, the best way I can answer that is, I've done a lot of reading of the journals of early Western travelers, fur trappers, etc. And one that really stands out in my mind, because I've read the Lewis and Clark journals numerous times, but when they were crossing the Gallatin Valley, which is where Bozeman, Montana is located, they were complaining the whole time about how the whole valley was just dammed up with beaver dams. And of course, they were traveling, by horse at that point. And so they were having to, skirt around these large areas of wetlands. And they mentioned that the whole valley was just like one big beaver dam, and that's just one example. But many of the streams in the west were covered with beaver colonies, and all the way downstream on a lot of these things, all the tributaries that led into even the major rivers like the Yellowstone and the Missouri, etc. All had beaver along them. So the trapping period eliminated beaver from a lot of those places. In fact, an interesting aside, just to tell a historical thing, Peter Skeen Ogden, for which Ogden, Utah is named, was hired by the Hudson's Bay Company, which had a post at Fort Vancouver, which is Vancouver, Washington today. And the Hudson's Bay Company saw trappers from the Americans being as competition for their sort of fur empire. So Peter Skeen Ogden was hired by the Hudson's Bay Company and was told to go out and trap as many beaver as he could between the Rockies and the Pacific to try to make a beaver death zone, or whatever you want to phrase it. I don't know how they phrase it, but the idea was, if there's no beaver there, we won't have to worry about the Americans taking over Oregon and Washington, and that was the fear of the British government at the time, is that they would lose those the land that was under control of Hudson's Bay Company at the time, but lose it to Americans. So they were trying to eliminate all the beaver. So that was a very common thing across the West during the fur trapping era, and then since that time, there's a lot of antagonism towards beaver from some people who, ranchers don't want to see their irrigation ditches dammed up and so forth. So we have had beaver removed from a lot of the landscape where they once were. And so the restoration of beaver has a lot to do with the restoration of aquatic ecosystems, which then therefore has a lot to do with the restoration and recovery of many, many species that are dependent on water.
That is a sign of a powerful species that had affected policy and planning for how to control literal territory politically. That's crazy.
Oh yeah, well, it was, the fur period, which didn't last that long in the West. I mean, it started in the 1600s on the East Coast, but in the West, probably by the 1840s, beaver were getting scarce enough that it wasn't economical in a lot of places for them to trap anymore. And, they would come back a couple of years later and there would, be some recovery, but continuously being exploited like that meant that they were taken out of many drainages. And it's hard for us to imagine today because, there's this whole thing, term that I and others have used called landscape amnesia. And landscape amnesia is that you don't know what the landscape once looked like, so you don't miss it. And, our riparian areas around the West are so degraded that most people see a stream and assume, I'll give a worst case scenario. you have a stream that's wide and shallow and has no vegetation along it, we're used to thinking of that as the norm, when in a lot of cases, those streams would be deep and narrow with willows and other vegetation favored by water growing along them. But because most of us have never seen that kind of place, we just assume that the degraded system is the standard. I was living in Vermont for a short time, and I went to this meeting when I first got there, where they were going to talk about what to do on a Vermont Fish and Game Wildlife Management Area, and the whole thing was we're going to have to log to get young vegetation for white-tailed deer, of course, like there isn't enough white-tailed deer, and And I thought, man, I can't believe these people. They just all want to, log the forest. And finally, this one guy stands up. He says, we have to do something about the old growth crisis. And I thought, oh my gosh, finally somebody's, seen the light. He says, the problem here in Vermont is we have too many young forests. Too many old forests. And we need to cut the trees to get them younger again. And the problem in Vermont is that almost all the forests have been logged at one time. So the only place you see big old trees is like in cemeteries or in front of 200-year-old farmhouses. So that's an example of landscape amnesia. People in Vermont have no idea what the forest once looked like, which was predominantly dominated by old growth trees in the old days.
This network design is obviously going to rankle most ranchers who have worked really hard to make sure beaver don't come back and make sure wolves don't come back to their area. They're working on eradication programs in the northern states, and can't wait to see more of the reaction.
Yeah, well, the point is that you have to. This is something that is defensible. In other words, you can replicate this using the criteria that we had anyway for size and connectivity and so forth. And you're going to come up with more or less the same reserve areas for wolves. And you can also then look and see what species are listed on the Endangered Species Act and that overlap the area that are in these reserves. That's another thing you can replicate. In other words, this is something that can be repeated, which is what you want in science, is something that if somebody else does it and follows the same methodology, they're going to come up with the same conclusions. And part of the goal here is to sort of, you might say, move the administration in a direction where they use some sort of mechanism or methodology that makes sense and is defensible scientifically. I mean, the idea that beaver and wolves affect the landscape and our keystone species is well accepted in the scientific literature, and it's also well accepted that they exist at much lower numbers and in much less of the landscape than they historically existed in. So for both reasons, restoring them has a lot to do with healing the land. And really, when you have these, the wolf issue is a good one because I've been dealing with that for a long time. And a lot of times, I think it's been understated why conservationists want to see wolves back and why ranchers and some of the, hunters and others maybe don't want to see wolves back. And it's more than just the fact, like take ranching. Wolves really don't take that much livestock. I mean, in the big scheme of things, they're going to lose a lot more livestock to, birthing and poisonous plants and so forth. The number of animals killed by wolves around the West is pretty insignificant in the big scheme of things. But what wolves represent to ranchers is uncontrollable nature. And that's what they're fighting all the time. If you're in agriculture, your whole success depends on how well you can cope with, natural opposition, so to speak, insects eating your crops, floods or drought, all sorts of fire that can, like in the case of ranchers, maybe a fire that burns up, the forage that you were going to depend on. So wolves are seen as just one more thing that's added to this mix of unpredictable nature. And there's a sense, that they can control that unpredictability by eliminating wolves. And on the other hand, I think people like myself want to advocate for wolf restoration because we see it as a way to sort of make amends for the past indiscretions and the past abuse of natural areas, and as a way to demonstrate a different attitude towards the land than we've had in the past, an attitude that appreciates natural ecological function and integrity, which is really the only way you get any kind of real stability is by having functioning ecosystems. And the way you get there is by putting as many of the pieces back as you can. And wolves and beaver are part of that, those pieces.
If we go forward maybe 50 years after we've really, really tackled this and done what you would consider a good job, what are we looking at in terms of hope, in terms of what that Western area and beyond is going to look like and feel like?
Well, that gets back to the landscape amnesia. Most of us have no idea what the Western landscape could really be like. But there's a couple of things in what you mentioned that I think is important, because if we can accomplish this, it does provide hope. And you got to have some hope. You don't have hope, you throw your hands up in the air and say, I might as well give up and party or something. And I think that this would demonstrate that as a society, we can make a collective decision that will change our relationship to how we view nature and what we do to the natural world. And so, even though it would only be the Western United States, what you say is that this is something that's a model that could be emulated in other parts of the world even. I mean, there are predators all over the world that are constantly being killed, whether it's Africa or Asia, Australia. I mean, we can go down the list. And there's probably equivalent species like the beaver in different types of ecosystems that are, keystone that way. So if we can pull that off here in the Western United States, particularly given the politics of the region, the generally conservative politics, then that gives you hope that it could be done other places. And then that gives you hope that we can actually pull off some sort of mitigation of our, terrible effect on the planet and make it a better place for everyone, not just humans, but all the other life out there that depends on the planet as well.
Is there any way that I could picture George Wuerthner standing next to a rancher that you've butted heads with all your life, working together because they've seen the light and they're on board?
I think that's a possibility, although I would tend to think, this is the problem when you get finances in it. And any rancher, they're always complaining about how they don't make any money. And there's some truth to it. I mean, raising livestock in the West is really kind of a crazy thing to do. It's just not the aridity imposes all kinds of limitations on what you can do. So I would suspect, what will happen is people in the ranching community will just say, this doesn't, especially if a buyout is available, this is my chance to get out of this situation, because ranching is just a good way to lose money. And so, most ranchers, the thing that keeps them in the business is the price of their property has gone up in value. So you can continuously buy against the equity of that ranch land, but it's not really running cattle that makes you any money. I think that, there will be a decline of ranching around the West regardless of this program. This might provide at least the ones that are within our reserve design some opportunity for a decent way out to do something else, whether it's some of the ranchers and farmers in places like California have gone to buy land in places like Kansas and Nebraska and Minnesota because it's just more productive and there's less hassles with other, people, not liking having your cows, stink up the landscape or whatever. So, that's an option some might take advantage of. As far as hunters, it depends upon how enlightened hunters are. I don't want to say that this is the reason why they should support wolf restoration, but the truth is that in most cases where wolves have been restored, the population of elk and deer have increased, not decreased. The increase in population is not uniform, of course, and the habitat use, and this is the big thing, the habitat use by those animals has changed in many cases. For example, the elk, when they're being preyed upon by wolves, tend to use steeper terrain and stay in more forested areas, because wolves are animals that chase down their prey. And if they're having to chase an elk through a lodgepole pine forest with lots of logs on the ground or something like that, it's very difficult. So the habitat use has changed, even though the number of elk and deer in a lot of cases has increased. But the habitat changes also mean that it's harder for hunters to find the elk or the deer. And so some of them are saying, oh, there's less elk and deer here. And in some cases there is, but in a lot of cases there's just as many or more. But you have to be a better hunter to
you got to be in better
achieve
shape.
success, so to speak. Better shape and know the animals better. Yes. And so the old days of where you would drive around on a dirt road or something until you shot something, well, maybe you can't do that anymore.
Well, what do you think about the next steps?
The first step is doing what you're helping me to do, which is get the word out, so to speak. And so, I'm trying to promote it by articles, and some of the other authors are doing exactly what I'm doing interviews and so forth, and trying to get the idea out there. And I hasten to add that getting the idea out there is not meaning that we expect immediate results. I mean, that would be wonderful if it did. But if you look at how conservation has gone over the decades, usually you have to have some proposal out there that takes a while to catch on. I'll use a simple thing. The national forests were first set aside as forest reserves. They were opposed strongly by residents in the Western United States. There was all this stuff about locking up resources. Sounds the same as today, actually, in some circles, but locking up resources, it's going to destroy the economy, blah, blah, blah. And yet, I think if you were to do a survey of Western residents and say, well, we're going to get rid of all the national forests in the West, you would be overwhelmingly voted down. Now, we have debates about how those national forests should be managed, but almost everybody today accepts that having national forests are a good thing for the country as well for the region. And I suspect that transformation will happen with this reserve proposal too, where the idea that we, which may be initially opposed, may gain acceptance. Okay, I've been involved in a thing for a couple of decades now called Restore the North Woods. I'm the board president of it, and I helped to start it. I was one of the founders of it. And our goal was to create a national park in the Maine woods. And we had a very ambitious plan, over a 3 million acre national park, which doesn't exist yet. But we have succeeded with the help of many people, including Burt's Bees' Roxanne Quimby, who purchased a bunch of land in the Maine woods. And that was part of the whole thing, because Maine had very little public land. You had to buy these lands from timber companies. But anyway, she bought these lands and donated to the U.S. With the idea that it would be part of the national park system managed by the Park Service. And during the time when we were promoting this idea of a national park unit in the Maine woods, almost all the congressional delegation and the governor, et cetera, in Maine expressed opposition to creating any park there, including the two senators from Maine today, Angus King and Susan Collins. Well, just last week, Angus King and Susan Collins sponsored legislation to expand the Katahdin Woods and Water National Monument, almost increasing it by 50%. And the point of this is, here are two politicians who, to one degree or another, oppose the whole idea of having any park at all. And today, they're sponsoring legislation to expand it. And so I've seen this over and over and over again. So I'm never dissuaded by somebody who says, "Oh, well, this is impossible," or "People will never support this," because I've seen so many examples where, over time, if it's a good idea, which I think parks and preserves and wilderness and so forth are, people find that they are a positive thing and a benefit, and to themselves, and for even reasons that we would say are non-economical or otherwise. Just the intrinsic value of having protected lands makes a lot of people feel good, and I think that's a benefit. That's how I look at this. This may not happen immediately, but we put the idea out there, and over time, I think people will come to accept it, not only accept it, but embrace it and promote it further. And that gets back to the question you had originally, what's this going to do for the planet? Well, if it gets embraced and promoted, it may be adopted in a lot of other places. A good example of that is Yellowstone National Park. That was the first national park in the world, and there are national parks in 140, 150 countries around the world. Why is that? Well, because it serves a purpose in the sort of the way people look at the landscape, and so it was emulated around the world. But it had to be done someplace first, and once it's in one place, it's much more likely to be adopted in other places, and that would be my hope.
This isn't the first wildlands design in the West, or
no.
You've proven your point, which is it should be replicatable. So with newfound interest and new interest period from an administration that's never uttered the words that they are uttering now, 30 by 30 and connectivity, and we've never had that kind of a benefit, with the work that we do. You get to see over all of these decades, the same landscapes keep showing up. Some of them are a little smaller because they've been whittled away, and others are bigger because they've been added to. You're showing that, this can be done. I think I saw a title somewhere that somebody said the answer, it was referencing the paper here, the answer to our problems in the West is to flood the West with wolves and beavers. And I was like, where did that come from? Because I don't see that anywhere in the paper, those exact words, but that's what somebody got out of it. And that's a really cool thing to see. I just like that you're proving once again, and everybody involved with this are proving that this can be done, and we can look at it in all kinds of different angles, and it still points to sound, solid science.
Yeah, and the choice of wolf and beaver was to make it somewhat simple to understand, and because these two particular species have an outsized influence on the landscape, they are good choices. In other words, you are going, as I think that we identified in the paper, 92 endangered species that would overlap with these reserves, and presumably most of them would benefit from the creation of these reserves. For example, among the species are various endangered fish or amphibians like various frogs and toads. So I'm using those two as an example, fish and amphibians that would benefit from beaver restoration without having to do anything directly for those species. You improve their quality of their habitat, and the hope is, of course, that they would start to flourish and also recover. Particularly with the wolf, they're a wide-ranging species, and because top predators, any predators, exist at much lower population than, say, herbivores like elk and deer, you have to have pretty large areas to sustain a viable population in the long run. So picking wolves as one of your species to focus on accomplishes the goal of having a larger area protected, and that larger area is going to be a net, you might say, that you throw over the landscape that pulls in a lot of other species that will ultimately benefit from that protected landscape.
to find the maps and the paper and everything referenced here, and surely some other things that George will provide me in the extra credit section, you need to go to rewilding.org/POD and look for episode 94. And you'll find all the resources that go with this, the maps and the actual study itself, and George's links to really get into this, do a deep dive, and go and take advantage of George's recommendation. We need people talking about this. So share this podcast and keep finding new ways to talk to people about rewilding, referencing this today as an example of what you're talking about, or any of the other resources, of course, at rewilding.org. George, thank you so much for taking the time today to be with us and to explain all this. It's really quite exciting.
Well, thank you, Jack. I mean, to me, it makes me feel a little optimistic that we're talking about this, just to even be talking about it. And if we can get some of this implemented, as I said, if even one state in the West were to adopt this as a policy, I think other states would see the advantages and follow through. So, it could happen in stages. It could happen, state by state. It could happen at a federal level. It's hard to say, but you have to have the idea, the basic idea, and then how it's implemented and the fine points we can, worry about and discuss later. But you got to have something to, throw out there as your goal. And that's what this is.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. We do what we do because of you. This podcast is supported by listeners like you who long to live in a wilder world. Please consider donating at rewilding.org and subscribe to our weekly news and article digest while you're there. To go the extra mile, you can follow and share Rewilding Earth on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Bonus points for sharing this podcast with your friends. To listen to past episodes, go to rewilding.org/pod. That's rewilding.org/POD.